Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Memorial Day, post-Memorial Day webinar. Looking towards summer, we're going to be talking about board retreats today, and it's going to be a fun and quick hour. We have a great panel of representatives from different school boards who have had retreats recently, and we'll be hearing from them in a little while. But first, we just want to sort of get everybody on the same page about that. So let's start. You know the VSBA staff. I'm just putting it up here to remind you that I'm disappearing. And Debbie Singeiser, who is on this call and will be working with me today, facilitating the webinar, is in her new role as Director of Board Services for VSBA. So Debbie, do you want to say anything?
Just hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Really excited to do this webinar with all of you. I love board retreats. I love doing them and I love talking about them. So I look forward to this webinar.
Thanks, Debbie. Carrie?
Hi, everyone. I just want to go over a little bit of the logistics with you all. If you have questions today, please ask them in the Q&A that's found at the bottom of the screen. We'd prefer not to use the chat very much today. Chats tend to bring some side conversations, and we'd like to have the Q&A, the questions in the Q&A. We will ask them anonymously when we get to break points for questions. At the end of the webinar, when you leave, you'll an evaluation will pop up. It's just 3 short questions. The first 2 are rankings from 1 to 5, and the last one is basically your comments. This only helps to make our webinars better every time, and we always strive to get better. Next, our follow-up email. Anytime that you register to attend any of our webinars, regardless of attendance, we send a follow-up email to you that has a link to the video, a link to the handouts or the PowerPoint slides. Also, it has links to any resources that were mentioned during the webinar, as well as if there's any open-ended questions that we weren't able to get to or that we were trying to follow up on. Those will also be in a follow-up email. Again, that's for all webinars, regardless of attendance. If you register for them, you'll get that information. We know that not everyone can make every webinar, so that's helpful to get the information out to you quickly afterwards. And finally, we have a video archive on our website. We have a YouTube channel, and we keep all of our video archives there. But on our website, we have a page you can go to under resources that has all of our archives of our videos for the last 2 or 3 years. Along with the handouts from the webinars and any information resources that you need from them. So if there's something, topic that you're looking for, you may find that information there. That's all I have to say. Thanks so much, Susan.
Thank you, Carrie. That's a great resource, that webinar archive. If you have strange things that you need to resolve, I encourage you to check that out as part of your research process. So a word about retreats. Oh, my slides are going to play games with me again today. So done well. I love these 2 quotes. I think they just set up the big picture focus that we hope will be in place for retreats. So it's how business gets done, not just doing more business. Many years ago, I owned my own business, and I attended an industry, it was a newspaper. I attended an industry gathering, and there was a guest speaker there. And I remember her asking, so what is the amount of time you spend, like, how do you divvy up your time between working at your business and working on your business? And that's sort of the same question that goes out to board retreats. This is an opportunity to work on your business. You work at it year round. And it's also an opportunity for some team building, right? Because you're outside of your normal board structure. Carrie, can we run that poll? We're going to do a really quick poll just to see where everybody is relative to retreats.
Is it up?
I'm seeing it.
Yes. Looks like one person hasn't answered yet.
Okay. Okay, so most of you are having board retreats this summer. I'm really happy to hear that, because we don't always know how that works out, and it's useful to know that, and helpful to know for today's conversation, that everybody's in this. So I appreciate that. Okay, let's see if I can continue doing this. Here we go. Okay. So why have a retreat? And I realize now I'm preaching to the choir on some of this, because most of you do have retreats planned. So we'll go through these quickly, but it is the perfect time to set your annual goals. You're staring down a new school year, and these goals, excuse me, can be goals for districts, goals for the board. You know, I've facilitated retreats where the board is really tripping over itself and getting in its own way. And so we take a bit of time and really talk about what is the board's work on the board's work for the year. And that can look like a lot of different things. One of the things I hope that boards concentrate on at their retreats is operating protocols, making sure those are in place and approved by everybody. Also, the board code of ethics that we have shared with all of you numerous times. It's a really good time to make sure that everybody understands what it is to work on your board, what's required, what the expectations are. And that way, when people are running for the board usually in the spring, or considering a board appointment, if you have a vacancy, they have access to, you provide them with those documents. And so they come in with the understanding of the expectations. And I think that's really important, but it's also important that you have your district goals established. And if not before, then certainly at retreat time. It's an opportunity to dig in deep. So it may be that your board is in a cycle where this is a really good time to either review and update or develop your strategic plan. It's a good, I mentioned before, looking at the big picture and not the minutia that we deal with day to day. It's team building, and it can be a re-energizing activity for the board. If you go somewhere different than you usually have your meetings, and you do something different, take some time out to have some fun together, have a meal together at a minimum, but go for a walk as a team. Or I remember one year at the VSBA board retreat, we were playing cornhole after lunch, and it was silly, but we did it together and it was fun. And it's also a good time to take those new board members aside and make sure everything's making sense to them. Again, if they've been elected in the spring, they've now had a few meetings under their belts, and they begin to understand what they don't know or what they do know. And so catching them up and bringing them into the culture of your board is handled nicely at the retreat without being disruptive to your regular meetings. So I said before, you can really dive in and look at something in detail. And so figure out in advance, if you can, as a team, what are those key issues that have been sitting on the table, sitting in the parking lot, waiting for this opportunity. And then you can really open up and get involved in the discussion and collaborate on how you're going to proceed and what the outcomes are, and then define your actions. So you have a plan when you leave your retreat on that deep focused topic that you had identified. Team building, I can't stress it enough. As a former board member myself, until I went to my first retreat, I had absolutely no sense of team or belonging to my board. But that first retreat, just having a chance to sit casually with people and chat over lunch made such a difference in terms of understanding who I was working with and sharing a little of myself with them as well. So it does improve communication and trust, most of all. Deep down, trust is the critical thing. For those of you who are in a planning capacity for your board, so mostly it's the board officers and superintendents, but not exclusively, I really encourage you to plan ahead. I say this every time I have the chance, but if a retreat is part of your annual work plan, that should be scheduled on the calendar way ahead. I think that is a beautiful thing to cover at your reorganizational meeting back in March or April. And then everybody puts the date on their calendars, and you don't have the nightmare of trying to find a time, especially if you're a big board. There are boards in the state right now that are 18 and 19 people. And trying to find a time for all of those people to get together conveniently is a full-time job. So set it way in advance when people's calendars aren't full. Go somewhere fun if you can. Be creative. If there's I know near me, there's a state park or city park that has pavilions, overhead pavilions. Why not plan your retreat there? There's picnic tables, there's plenty, they should have Wi-Fi access and you should be good to go. And it's just a different environment. I mean, Megan's sitting outside today because she can, and you can still be productive, but have it feel a little more natural. Always, always, always plan to break bread at your retreats. I think that too goes to the team building piece. And make sure you have enough time to run your whole agenda. These are deep and big issues that take a long time to discuss. So don't try to cram too much in, because doing so just messes with being able to accomplish anything. If you have your goals halfway defined and you have your strategy halfway defined and you've sort of talked a little bit about board protocols, and there you are, you've accomplished nothing. Whereas if you give yourself a shorter agenda with time to go deep, you'll really come out of there feeling renewed. Skip that one. Oops. Well, I went way too far, so I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm happy to take questions if there are any right now. Carrie, I'd be surprised, but anybody have any questions about those basic understandings of what goes on at a retreat?
I don't have any questions at this time.
Okay, then. In that case, I would like to introduce our panel. We are joined today by two superintendent board chair teams and one rogue board chair whose superintendent was not available to join us today, sadly. So I'd like to introduce you all to Eric Mondrian. He is the chair of the Wells Springs Unified Union School District, which is part of the Greater Rutland County Supervisory Union. So he is chair of a board with small schools, and also participates in the SU board. Then from Franklin West, we have Fletcher board chair Tara Sweet and Superintendent John Teague. Fletcher is one of 3 individual districts within that Franklin West SU, and Tara also sits on the SU board. Do you, Tara? Okay. But they do their retreats as districts, as does Greater Rutland. And then we have Megan Roy and Flor Diaz-Smith, who are respectively superintendent and board chair of the Washington Central Unified Union School District. Did I get that right? And so that is a completely unified district where there is a larger board for all the schools in the communities it serves. And so they have different structures, and I believe they have had some really different experiences at recent retreats. And that's why we've invited them here to talk about those experiences. And we invite your questions throughout. Please, as you think of them, feel free to type them in. We'll stop and pause for questions. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, panelists, for joining us today. We have a list of questions that we hope to get through. There's about 5 questions, and I'm going to start right off the bat by asking each of you to tell us very briefly, in a couple minutes or less if you can, kind of the 5 W's that we always hear about in terms of your last board retreat. So who was there? What did you focus on? When did you hold it and how long was it? Where did you decide to hold it? And why did you opt to have a board retreat? Actually, that question probably makes more sense coming first, right? So why did you opt to have a board retreat, followed by those W questions? So I have Eric to my right. So Eric, do you mind going first?
Not at all. Thank you. So why we had a board retreat last year, mainly the year before in 2021, we had a really good board retreat, but by the time we reorganized in 2022, we had a lot of turnover and some members new. So the retreat was kind of focused on just revisiting the goals that we had set out the year before, or just reaffirming them. So we did it in late July, and we did it. It was about 2 hours long, with like a scheduled meal break in there, and we had invited our superintendent, of course, and our 2 principals. They have always participated in the our retreats, so that continues. And instead of having it at one of the local schools, we found another building within the community that we can hold it on, and that was mainly our focus, is just to revisit and make sure that this board is still on the same, or if not, path or focus as what we had achieved the summer before. You're muted.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that very much. So let's go next to the Franklin West Supervisory Union, and we'll start off with Tara, who is obviously Fletcher School District. Why don't you tell us, and then John, you can jump in and add what you want to what Tara has to say in terms of those 5 W questions.
Hi, so our why was we hadn't done it in quite a long time. I think 2018 with some staffing changes at the supervisory union. And then the pandemic, we didn't have a retreat, and we had obviously new people coming on the board as well. So we just needed to redo the whole thing. As John was now our permanent superintendent, we needed to have a time as a board to meet with John and figure out our plan for the year. We had the administration and the board. In addition, we do a dinner, which we find is really great time to interact with new staff, with new board members. But this year we actually invited new staff that had started in the school year, so that the board had a chance to meet the new staff and interact with them. And it was kind of really, for me, beneficial, because sometimes I hear the staff names when they're hired, but I'm not in the school, so I don't see them. So being able to put the name to a face and have a quick conversation with them was actually very helpful throughout the school year, I feel like. We chose not to have it at our location, so we went to building here in town, our historical society, that had a full kitchen, and actually John brought his grill and grilled burgers and dogs. We made a whole summer event, And we always have a hard time in the summer finding a time too. So we usually do it, if we can, a week before or around our August meeting. So then that way it's already in people's calendars, and maybe we bump it up an extra hour or two, start it earlier if we can, just to that way it's already a spot on people's calendars. Sometimes we do move it ahead, but that's one of the other things we've done. I'll let John add.
I think you pretty much nailed it for Fletcher. Yeah, the benefit of having it on the same day, same night as a board meeting is we do typically 2 or 3 hours before, have some dinner, and then continue on with our actual board meeting. So it's kind of one night out in August. Similarly in the other 2 schools, same sort of reason, that just to try to get together. I think it's really important to have that opportunity to meet outside of the regular board meetings when everybody shows up at 6 o'clock and we do the business and then we go home. It really has slower pace to allow people to get to know each other a little bit, come to an understanding. And I think it certainly helped with the boards to be able to better understand each other as people moving forward. So we're not just, necessarily about ideas. I think the format that we used was at this board meeting, we talked about successes, we talked about challenges, and we talked about opportunities. And from those, we were able to establish some goals for the year for the board to work on. Where the other 2 schools did them in their schools. So the where was, in the schools. And part of that, at least in one of the schools, was that during the retreat, sometimes we take the board on a tour of the building where they may not necessarily be able to see, either what's happened in the last year, if there's been any kind of upgrades or things like that to the building. It's nice to be able to take them around to see those. And I think my 2 minutes are up.
Thank you both very much. So last but not least, Flora and Megan, if you all could share your 5 W's, it's starting with the why did you decide to have a board retreat? And who would like to go first? Megan, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. Flora can fill in as well. I would actually answer this in 2 ways because our retreat last year is a little bit different than our retreat that we're planning this coming year, because this is my first year. So last year's retreat, which was in August, the first part of it was in August, was really partially for me to be able to get to know the board in a different capacity and outside of a regular board meeting. And we did have an outside facilitator, Bill Gore, and it was really focused on learning. We also had a second speaker come in, and really the whole norm of the night, it was offsite. We did have dinner, and we really focused on getting to know me and board members, doing some board learning together, and sort of readying ourselves at the end for a second part where we would define the work plan for the year. Looking ahead to this coming retreat this summer, and we use the practice of splitting it in 2, so there are 2 shorter meetings. I should say too, our hope is to establish this as our system moving forward. We don't have really a system, but we're gonna build it this way. And the first half, which will be in June, we'll have our administrative team with us, all of our principals, and the goal is reflection and looking back on the year, and having each school share, and actually I would say not just each school, but having them together on behalf of the district share our work towards our 3 priority areas. And then that should get us ready for the second part, which is just myself and the board, which is more focused on how we will do our work next year. And Flora's term for the theme is kind of establishing the governance culture for our board, which is a really good time for that because we're not a newly consolidated district, but we sort of are building those structures. So I'm going to stop there because I know Flora has more to share and can fill in the blanks, but I would just say I'm really excited about our upcoming retreats. I think it will help us frame how we do our work. And I think if there's something to emphasize, it is the idea of solidifying, this is how we do our work. We always have a retreat. This is loosely what we do and how we do it. That doesn't mean it's the same agenda every year, but the more you can build that, it really is also building how you do your work. So I'll stop and Fleur can fill in.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, Megan did a great summary of it. I could just add, just so that, you know, right now we have it going really well, but I know that some boards are not starting where we are. So our first retreat was really back in 2019, and Susan held that retreat for us. And not every, you know, we didn't really have at that point buy-in from the entire board to be in a retreat, but we've been, you know, so we've been saying it's August, you know, the first week of August, and last year, like Megan was saying, what we've been focusing more is that the more than the board understands our that equity set the tone, we set the culture. So last year, part of the emphasis of working with Phil was that besides affirming our goals, we were gonna do some learning at every month through governance, so what is best governance. So we read Phil's book, and we, at the retreat, we decided what was going to be the board. So that's the only thing I have to add, really. What was going to be the board learning for the year? Because that helps us get not really buy-in, but understand what our job is and how we affect student achievement as board members, and how we can concentrate on what is important and how we make decisions together for best outcomes for kids. That's it.
Thank you all. I feel like, I don't know about you, Susan, but I feel like everybody touched on one of the primary reasons for holding a board. I think we hit them all. I heard goal setting. I heard relationship building multiple times, getting to know a new superintendent, having the board get to know a new superintendent, the planning for the upcoming year for sure, and also the learning and the professional development, like Fleur just mentioned, like taking advantage of this time to get together to do some professional development. I mean, it's and a meal. I feel like everybody had a meal of some sort, whether it was lunch or dinner. So you guys are a great representation. I can see why Susan asked you to be part of this panel today, because you've really touched on all the reasons why a board retreat can be so impactful.
And this may be a little bit redundant, this next question. So if you feel that you've already shared out on this, we'll just move on. And I think at this point, now that we've gotten the introductions, we'll just jump into the conversation rather than going around the room, as it were. Is everyone comfortable with that working system? Okay, so the next question really is, what was your objective for having your retreat? And the second half of that is, did you accomplish it? And as Debbie said, you've all already mentioned the goal setting and the board, how the board does its business. I liked the way Megan put that. Were there more other specific objectives that anybody had going into your retreat? Developing a strategic plan, hammering out the board protocols, figuring out a construction timeline if there's construction in your future.
I can jump in. Again, we're in between. We haven't had our summer retreat yet. I would say that last year's retreat objectives, which were to learn together and identify what our learning would be for the year, we did accomplish that. We did have a set of learning goals that continued throughout the year. And I think if we hadn't, I think that set the stage well for what our goal is. Slightly different, or I guess it's bigger than just learning for this year. Our goal is really to start to solidify how we function together. And I think that we will accomplish that partially because of that learning that we did through the course of the year. I would say one thing that I think prompted our slightly different focus for this coming year is because when you get down to the grain size of some of those things you mentioned, Susan, like building your work plan and scheduling, things like that, I'm not sure we did that quite as tightly as we could have at the end of that last one. And I think the goal with this summer, really solidifying those two parts, is to accomplish both that high level how do we want to work together, and some of that logistics. So I think we're set up well to do that.
Thanks. Eric?
Yeah, like I said earlier, it was mainly just to kind of focus on our board goals, and I think we accomplished that. There was some really good discussion, and we ended up kind of settling on the similar goal areas that we had previously discussed. So I would say, that was a good accomplishment. But I'll add that we also had board operating protocols on our agenda as well, which is something that we discussed. As a suggestion from Phil. So we talked about that, and I think that was a pretty good accomplishment because it started with the model VSBA, and over the next several months we ended up customizing it to what the board felt would be appropriate. So, and it started with the retreat. So
Great.
And I would say the objectives were slightly different for each of the three boards, whether it was to become more collaborative. But the other thing I think that we did accomplish was sort of establishing the operating procedures for the boards, like what are the issues that rise to a board level? How do we get to that place? Does, every conversation that you have on the sidelines of a soccer game need to come to the board, or should it go through? So being able to establish those relationships, the principals had the opportunity to ask questions and clarify expectations from the board in terms of their role in operations. And so I think it may not have been our initial objective, but in the conversation, it was about like, well, what's at the 50,000 foot level? What's at the 10,000 foot level? What's the on the ground stuff, and who's worrying about each of those levels? And that, I think, became clear across all three boards in the district.
I'm going to go off script here because I have another question that's really primarily exclusively for Eric, John, and Tara. And that is, you all do your retreats by district. And I'm wondering if there's ever been discussion of an SU retreat, or if that just doesn't feel like it's something that would be meaningful to your within your structure.
I'll jump in, John, correct me, add, but I feel like it's been talked about, and I don't feel like it got like a lukewarm reception with the board. I think we even talked about a little bit this year. One of the things that we do as a board, though, is we do to get together 3 or 4 times a year as a full carousel board with all of the 3 boards together to look at big topics that the administration normally would have to, tell us individually 4 times. So if it's all the same general data, so we all get it together. So then we, well, at least when Fletcher hosts it, we have a meal. Sometimes the other schools do as well. So again, there's that time to kind of get together and meet other people that you don't normally meet who aren't on the SU board, right? So for us, it's 3 separate boards plus the SU board, which has members from each. So there's a few members on each board that aren't included. So we get to meet them, have opportunity to chat with them, etc.
So that's kind of, there's a social component to those meetings as well. Okay. Eric, do you know in your district?
you mean supervisory union?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had last fall, I think it was, we ended up having like a treat, and a retreat. It was combined into like a regular meeting. And it was just focused on mainly superintendent goals. So it's not, the SU retreat wasn't like in a format with the facilitator. The board felt that we didn't need a facilitator. But it did have an objective that I think was met. I think that even an SU board, our SU board is 10. So I think it would be beneficial even for supervisory union, but yeah, there's no plans or talks of us having a retreat this year, but with all the member districts looking at doing their own retreats, I think it's a big ask, but yeah.
Fair enough. And it's in my head sort of as a leftover piece of the consolidations that took place through Act 46, in the sense that one of the issues there was the superintendent's capacity to be spread very thin. I know in my home district, our superintendent had to attend 7 different board meetings every month, and 2 of those boards had twice a week meetings. And so it was, it got kind of insane. And by having the carousel format and later consolidation, it certainly changed the superintendent's relationships with the boards, because it freed them up to have greater capacity of energy for the job, rather than sitting through all those evening meetings. And so that was really behind that question in part. John, you have anything to add on that subject of the SU retreat? I do know that in a lot of the SU structures, the district boards are not so friendly with one another, and that can be an issue.
I think our district boards get along fine. When we have the SU meetings and the carousel meetings, I think if we were going to have an SU retreat, I'd want that to be the retreat and not have it be the 4th retreat on top of the 3 others. And I don't know that we would get to the specific needs and conversations of each of the schools, because each one is slightly different. So if we can figure out how to do one giant retreat, I'd be all for it.
Well, I'll throw this one out at you. Consider a carousel retreat where the first half of the meeting, maybe I'm stuck in the day-long model, but I realize that doesn't work for everybody, but where you did the SU in the morning and then it broke out into the individual boards for the afternoon or something like that. Just a thought. But I want to thank Eric for the segue that you gave me, because the next, I believe you all have opted to have, oh, this is not me, this is Debbie.
It's fine. You were
No.
doing a good job, Susan. You were on a flow.
That's okay, go.
But yeah, I think you all did opt to have a facilitator at your retreats. And so I just wanted to find out from you, did you find that helpful? And would you recommend that to other boards who are planning their first retreats? Did it help you produce? Do you think it helped you produce the results that you were going for?
I'll jump in. I think it was really helpful to have Phil be the facilitator. We had done retreats the year prior when I was the interim superintendent, and I facilitated. And we used, I think there were 7 questions that are in one of the VSBA handbooks to guide our work. But with Phil facilitating, I was able to be more of a participant, more actively listening rather than trying to capture and lead the conversation. So I think to that extent it was helpful, and he was able to hear things and guide the conversation in one way or another that ultimately led us to a good place. So.
Yeah, we've always had a facilitator come in and I always say that it's the reason why is, well, I'm not qualified to do it. I don't think I'm qualified, and also being our participant makes a difference. But it has produced the results that we've wanted, and we've had a couple different facilitators over the years.
I'll jump in to piggyback on John. Not only to let him be participatory, but sometimes the boards have a tendency to go off topic or side stories. So having a facilitator who's not necessarily in the community or involved is able to get us back on task a little bit quicker than normal.
I would add to that sort of a both and. offer, which is we did have a facilitator. It was really important, particularly in my first year, to have someone else besides me being responsible for fostering the conversation, and it was connected to our board learning, so there was a really clear thread. I also think it depends somewhat on what the goals for your retreat are. We heading into our June retreat, we really wanted to center our leadership team and their reflection to help foster some better relationship between our board and our principals and give the board a better sense of what happens in the buildings. And so we are not having an external facilitator for June. We haven't decided yet for August. And so I think to some extent, really being solid on the goal for your retreat can help answer the question of whether or not that lends itself for a facilitator or not. But it was very, very helpful for the purpose of our retreat last year.
Thank you all for that input. And I, because I am in a unique position, I can put in the shameless plug, so I might as well. Of course, VSBA does provide services. A number of you mentioned that Phil Gore had facilitated for you. VSBA does provide facilitation services at probably below market rate. I can't swear to that. I haven't been out doing research on it, and Debbie is poised to be in that position for this summer if you haven't gotten through your planning phases yet. And so now let's shift gears a little bit. You've alluded to some of this, but have your retreats, or your last retreat, what impact did that have on relationships? Did it help strengthen relationships? And if so, how? Did it maybe expose some fragile relationships that you now have been able to work on and improve? What impact has that kind of different meeting had on your organizations? Terry, you had mentioned that your non-retreat retreats with the SU gives you the opportunity to meet all the board members from the other districts who are still within your same SU. So that's the kind of thing that seems relevant to me. But also, and certainly Megan and Floor, you've talked about how you were new to each other, and so it was a building process, and that was like the first shot in the arm. Other comments about relationships?
Susan, we do have a question.
Okay, let's throw that out.
All right. I'm a part of a small board, 5 people who all work full-time, and we oversee one of the largest districts in the state. We have a hard time scheduling any meeting, never mind a full day retreat. Any suggestions on getting fellow board members buy-in and scheduling help? They are not jazzed about the idea of a team building.
Any of the panelists want to speak to that? Because I know some of you are in similar circumstances.
I would say that what we've had success, at least with one board where people are working, is that we have the retreat start at 3 o'clock on this day that we're going to have a 6 o'clock board meeting. And so it's only part of the day that they need to miss from work. We get 3-hour work session in, including dinner, and then we get into our regular board meeting. So I think coupling it with that, and in terms of team building activities, just a meal is enough of a team building activity. I don't know that you need to do some sort of ropes course or anything like that to really be team building. I think just the opportunity to have a conversation with somebody that you're sitting on a board with and don't necessarily get the chance to chat with regularly is probably enough team building to start.
Yeah, and if you can hear, I'm gonna jump in. My internet has been unstable, but I agree with what John just said about scheduling in a meeting that you already have. And then I know that they're not just about team building. Mine were not for a long time. But I think the most important thing is to remind them what I said at the beginning, the impact that we can have in student outcomes, and that we set the culture for, for learners. We keep telling our kids, that growth mindset and that lifelong learners. So we set that culture. So that's been not easy, but it's something to persuade them.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I agree with what John said too, especially with eating a meal could be a form of team building, taking the time away from the work and then just chit chatting amongst each other. And a full day retreat, you could always try, setting a specific time, 2-hour time limit. No, if you have, seeing you have a large district, maybe it might take more time, but another thing is, I don't know if you're the chair of the board, but if advocating for how important it is to have a retreat, might change some minds, and people might take the time to free up the schedule too. But that's one thing that, always have a challenge with, is having a retreat additional to, that's why it's usually in the summertime. And this year we're opting to have a retreat instead of a meeting. People don't get burned out.
I think that's not an uncommon practice, Eric, to skip a July or August business board meeting because school is not in session. So there tend to be fewer crises in the moment, and that business stuff can be deferred. If it can, then you can replace one with the other. And the other thing that I would just add to answer that concern is that most, in my experience, most organizations that really need some help with team building have no interest in doing team building. And so I think it maybe becomes a sub-agenda, a hidden agenda, let's say, where you're not going to have agenda items saying team building, but it might be fun, or take a break time and some other activity goes on during break time. So I wouldn't necessarily set out to have a retreat whose stated objective for all to see is we're going to have team building. Just a thought. Debbie, you want to pick up?
Yeah, so looking towards the future and what's coming up for you all in terms of your districts and SUs, what are you guys planning for the summer? Just curious to know, are you planning on having a retreat? I know a couple of you did touch on that already, but what and how might that be different from what you've had in the past, or is it going to be pretty much the same?
I think we have 3 of them soft scheduled for the three boards. I don't know that we've gotten in on the hard date and the hard time, but the intent is that we will have the 3 board retreats for the 3 different school districts. The other thing is, I believe it's in our either our code of ethics or our board norms that we have a retreat every year. So that just becomes part of the business of the board. That's what we do to continue to professionally grow, and it's in writing. And so it's not really an argued point, but we know we're having them. We just haven't got to the firm detail, and whether we're bringing a facilitator in or not will depend on Debbie's availability, possibly. So, yeah.
Yeah, John, John and I haven't discussed it. I think it's in our meeting in another week or so that we'll be having, is to start planning that portion of our retreat for Fletcher anyway. And John's right. The SU code of norms is the one thing we took out, was because the SU wasn't into wanting to do a full wide SU retreat, but we kept it in our 3 individual ones.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we're planning a retreat instead of a regular board meeting. I have a facilitator, one of our previous facilitators coming. The board decided that we were going to, focus on the previous broad goal areas that we discussed last summer. And, just kind of come to a conclusion on that. And also our supervisory union is wrapping up a strategic plan. So working with the facilitator on that, we might or should incorporate some of that into this this month's retreat or this summer's retreat.
And I think that Washington Central has already shared their plans with us. A two-part retreat, early summer and late summer. The second one to be determined or to be defined after the first one. So I have that pretty much right. Pending the
Yes.
outcomes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, John, John and Tara, I love that your board retreats are built right into your operating protocols. It's part of board work. No surprises to anybody when they get to the board table. That's great. Well done. Are there any other questions or comments or thoughts from the panelists about the impact of the retreat, the process, anything having to do with your retreats? And at the same time, I'll ask the question of the audience, is there anything more that anybody has questions about or concerns or thoughts that you would like to share? We always welcome all input.
A question I had, which was a concern I had when I was board chair, and I'd like to hear what the panelist says about this, is sometimes money is a factor, cost. And so I was just curious to know, is this, first of all, does the cost of the retreat have to be very expensive? Or how could we think of cost saving ways to do a retreat if we don't have a lot built into our budget?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. We always do like a potluck style, or someone cooks something and brings it, and that works out pretty well. And if we're not using one of the schools, we have, like I said earlier, access to another community building, and they don't charge for it as long as we leave it the way we found it. I don't know if everyone has that type of situation, but yeah, we've never really had, I never really considered the cost other than the cost of the facilitator, which can get up there.
Yeah,
I'd have-
the
ahead.
location doesn't have to be someplace fancy.
I was just going to echo the same thing, Eric. We do the same, that we do a potluck. Everyone signs up to bring stuff. And when we do have it off site, it's usually, well, in the past, there was a board member who had a big deck and we had it at her house, but she's no longer on the board. So this last retreat was at a community center in town. Again, no cost to us as long as we leave it the way we found it. They didn't care. So like I said, John brought his grill and we had burgers and dogs and all the sides. So
Nice. Okay, well, I think then if everybody has said what's on their mind and the audience is satisfied that we've covered off everything, we are good to close this out. Thank you all very much for participating. Please do take a minute and a half to do the survey at the end, because that's how we get better. We need your input. We want to make sure that our topics all stay relevant and that we're covering them in ways that make sense to you as board members. And we get a lot of information from those surveys, so we do really appreciate them. And I think that's it. So thank you very much for participating. Special thanks to the panel. You, as expected, you were wonderful. And I think you provided everybody with some food for thought and some great experiential learning. So thanks. Get out and enjoy the sunshine if you have a chance. It's gorgeous out there. Bye all.